What is up, guys? Today I want to speak to you about a very specific topic of spells in Commander, specifically for casual Commander. And what spells am I talking about? These are extra turn spells. Majority of the time they are found in blue and red, and these are spells that allow you to take another turn immediately after the turn that is currently happening. Now, are extra turn spells casual in Commander is my question for today, and I would say generally they are casual. There's a few that see some competitive play, specific combos to allow you to take infinite turns, but specifically for casual Commander, I think they are casual, but they are not very fun to play against. So generally I avoid them. There are certain scenarios where they are fine. I think they fit very well into specific decks. And today I want to speak to you about some of these scenarios where you can fit extra turn spells into certain strategies and which ones you should try and avoid. Most people, when they think of extra turn spells, the first thing that pops into their head is Narset Enlightened Master. Now, this is notoriously a pretty broken casual commander. I mean, it's seen a little bit of competitive play here and there, but generally, it's by nowadays standards, it's pretty casual. It is just extremely unfun to play against because they will attack, and after that attack, they will chain extra turn spell after extra turn spell, extra combats. Aside from Narset, I want to discuss a couple of these other extra turn spells that I think can see play in specific scenarios. So the first thing I want to discuss is synergistic extra turns. And for this, there's a specific commander and a specific extra turn spell that pops directly into my mind. The extra turn spell is Elrond's Epiphany. It released in Kaldheim, 7 mana sorcery. You make 2/1/1 birds with flying, and then you take an extra turn, and it exiles itself. Elrond's Epiphany also has Foretell. Now, a friend of mine has got a Renar the Everwatchful deck, which allows you to foretell once a turn for free. And this is an absolutely fantastic fit in this deck. Synergizing with the Foretell part of Renar, and my friend's deck is half Foretell, half Spirits, and it just makes a fantastic include in the deck. So there, I have no problem with this. That is a great synergistic include in a Renar deck. And there's a few other synergistic extra turn spells that are flipping coins. So if you are playing a flipping coin commander or theme in your deck, for example, Yushri, Fortune's Flame, that's an Izzet commander that is flipping coins and allowing you to cast things for free if you win enough flips. So in a deck like this, you'll be playing lots of the synergies that you want to use when flipping coins anyway. So Krark's Thumb, to name one, allows you to flip twice instead and you pick one result. Another commander pairing that works really well is Akone, Eye of Chaos, and Sundar Split, Eye of Wisdom. These are also flipping coins and benefiting off flipping coins. So playing Stitch in Time or Ral Zarek. Stitch in Time says flip a coin. If you win the flip, you take an extra turn. So it's a 50-50, but you want to be flipping coins in these decks anyway because you generally benefit off of it. And Ral Zarek is a Planeswalker, so it can fit in a Izzet Planeswalker deck. But its ultimate is to -7, flip 5 coins, take an extra turn after this one for each one that comes up heads. They are themselves flipping coins to give you extra turns. Now, extra turns, as I said, aren't particularly fun, but if I was building a flipping coin deck, I would seriously consider these. If you're building an Izzet Planeswalker deck, then Ral Zarek would fit anyway, because if you are limited in colors to 1 or 2 colors for a Planeswalker deck, you are severely limited on your options of Planeswalkers to include, so I could see Ral Zarek going in an Izzet Planeswalker deck as well. Let me know in the comments below if you'd like to see me build an Ovika Enigma Goliath deck as an Izzet Planeswalker deck. I thought that would be quite an interesting build around. There's a few more synergistic extra turn spells I'd like to talk about. Firstly, this Plea of Power. It has Will of the Council, and when you play it, you vote. Each player votes for time or knowledge. If time gets more votes, you get an extra turn, and if knowledge gets more votes or the vote is tied, you draw 3. This is almost exclusively a 4-mana draw 3 because no one will vote for you to have an extra turn. In a Tivit Seller of Secrets deck, where you get to vote in additional time, this is an excellent fit. If it's the last 1 versus 1, then you are guaranteed an extra turn. You vote for time twice. But then there's other cards in a Tivit deck that allow you to vote more times anyway. So you might be able to squeeze an extra turn out of Plea for Power in a Tivit deck. Very low chances, but still a fantastic include in a Tivit deck nonetheless. The next one is Part the Water Veil. And Part the Water Veil is a 6-mana sorcery, take an extra turn, and then it exiles. It's a pretty average extra turn spell. It does have Awaken 6, where you can pay 6 blue, blue, blue. And if you cast it for that 9 cost, then you also put 6+1 counters on a land you control. It becomes a 0/0 elemental with haste that's still a land. If you're doing an animating lands theme in blue, Simic decks do this quite a bit, as well as Azorius decks. For example, Noyandar Royal Shaper, an extremely underwhelming commander, where you want to chain instants and sorceries to make your lands massive and then swing with your lands. In that deck, I can see it working pretty well because you're animating your lands anyway. So if you do happen to have 9, you can use it to get an extra turn and animate a land. And then the last one is Khan's Temporal Sundering. If you're playing a legendary theme, say with Yoshimaru and Sakashima, an Azorius Legends Matters partner deck, for example, then Khan's Temporal Sundering might work well. But in general, I avoid Khan's Temporal Sundering, even though it does bounce something and let you have an extra turn and it exiles itself. I just feel like there could be more synergy in your deck versus including a Khan's Temporal Sundering. This brings us now to tribal extra turns, and surprisingly, there are some tribal extra turn spells. These tribal extra turn spells have creature types. For example, Medamai the Ageless is a 6-mana Azorius Sphinx. It's a 4/4 flyer, and when it does damage to a player, you get an extra turn, and it can't attack during extra turns, so you can't chain the extra turns over and over. This is a really interesting creature. It would fit well in any Sphinx tribal deck because Sphinxes are almost exclusively blue-white, except maybe a mono-blue Sphinx deck, then it won't fit. Where I've seen this card do particularly well is in a Rafik of the Many deck. Now, Rafik of the Many is in banned colors, so it fits, and it has Exalted. So when a creature you control attacks alone, it gets +1/+1 till end of turn. But also, when a creature you control attacks alone, it gains double strike until end of turn. So if you attack with your Medamai with Rafik in play, it gives your Medamai double strike, so it does damage twice, triggering Medamai twice, and you then gain 2 extra turns afterwards. So it's an absolutely fantastic fit in that deck. Then we have Notorious Throng, which is a tribal sorcery rogue for 4. And it has Prowl for 6, so you can cast it for 6 if you dealt damage with a rogue this turn. If you are playing a rogue tribal, then you are getting in for damage with rogues all the time. So this will almost always be able to be cast for its Prowl cost of 6. And what does it do? It makes X 1/1 black rogue creature tokens with flying, where X is the damage dealt to your opponents this turn. That is fantastic. You hit with a bunch of rogues, which are often unblockable, and you make a bunch more rogues with flying. That's really good card anyway. But if you pay its Prowl cost instead, you take an extra turn. So in a rogue tribal deck, this is a fantastic fit. It can help you close out the game. Another tribe that has got extra turn creature stapled on, and that is Wonderwine Prophets. Wonderwine Prophets is a 6-mana 4/4 merfolk wizard with champion a merfolk, so you have to have a merfolk in play when it comes in. And when it deals combat damage to a player, you can sacrifice a merfolk. If you do, you take an extra turn after this one. Merfolk Tribal does not need help at all. It's a great tribe anyway. This is an incredibly strong Merfolk because when you damage, you sack a Merfolk for an extra turn. You can play another Merfolk in that extra turn, swing again, sack that one. So you can chain extra turns over and over. It's great for finishing out the game, especially if you have a giant board of island walking merfolk already. That brings me to 3 more tribal extra turn spells, and these are creatures that are wizards. So these could go in any wizard tribal deck. The first being Time Stream Navigator. Now, Time Stream Navigator is quite interesting because it can go in an Azorius human deck, it can go in a Izzet pirate deck, or it can go in any wizard deck. So this one fits in many different tribes because it has 3 tribes stapled onto it. And it's a 2-mana 1/1 with Ascend, where you get the City's Blessing for the rest of the game if you have 10 or more permanents. And you can pay 2 blue blue and tap and put it on the bottom of your library, and then you take an extra turn after this one, and you can only do it if you have the City's Blessing. So in a human pirate wizard deck, it's a pretty good include because you can't activate that extra turn early in the game because you need to have the City's Blessing first in order to do it. And people can see it coming from a mile away, so removal deals with it quite easily. The next 2 human wizards are Sage of Hours and Lighthouse Chronologist. Sage of Hours Whenever you cast a spell that targets it, you put a +1 counter on it, and you can remove all +1/+1 counters from it, and for each 5 counters removed this way, you take an extra turn after this one. This can go in blue decks that are constantly targeting your own creatures. It can go in Simic +1/+1 counter themes, and it's a wizard, so you could put it in any wizard deck if you wanted, but it won't likely get that much value in a wizard deck. It fits in other themes generally. And Lighthouse Chronologist is a 2-mana 1/3 creature human wizard with level up. So you can level it up, and once it reaches level 7 plus, at the beginning of each end step, if it's not your turn, you take an extra turn after this one. So that is an incredibly powerful effect, but it requires a lot of mana, a lot of investment, and your opponents have plenty time to deal with it. These are, I would say, the creature form extra turn spells are pretty balanced. They're easy to deal with, and if they aren't dealt with once you've presented them as a threat to your opponents, then you get a big benefit off of them having that extra turn, which can be game changing. The next category I want to move on to are Planeswalkers. The first one, which is in blue, is Ikamoon Gauntlet. And this is a new card from Phyrexia All Will Be One. It's a 3-mana blue artifact, and it gives your Planeswalkers the ability to 0 them to proliferate and -12 to take an extra turn after this one. It gives all your Planeswalkers the ability for you to take extra turns on a -12. You might be able to get this off on one of them, but getting this off on multiple Planeswalkers is incredibly difficult. It has an added bonus of whenever you cast a non-creature spell, you choose a counter on target permanent, put an additional counter of that kind on that permanent. This helps you when you are casting non-creatures to slowly tick up the loyalty of your different Planeswalkers. This card I think is perfectly balanced because as a friend once said to me, what is the rule with Planeswalkers? You attack them until they die. And that is why Planeswalkers are generally quite bad in Commander. As soon as they hit the battlefield, there are 3 players likely with creatures that are going to be attacking your Planeswalkers constantly. They are instantly removed. It is incredibly difficult for them to build up enough loyalty to use their meaningful abilities. So Ikamoon Gauntlet, it's a very nice include in a deck like that, just for the proliferate alone or the casting non-creatures to tick up loyalty. The -12 can happen. I think it would be very rare that that does actually happen. This is a fine include for Planeswalker decks. That's just an added bonus of maybe taking an extra turn every now and then. Planeswalker decks do suffer a lot to constantly being attacked by creatures, though, which makes the extra turn -12 a lot worse. Getting into some of the Planeswalkers other than Ral Zarek that can give you extra turns, we have Mu Yanling, which is a 6-mana 5 loyalty blue Planeswalker, and its ultimate -10 is tap all your opponent's creatures and you get an extra turn. Getting to 10 is incredibly difficult, especially on a 6-cost Planeswalker. You would use these for the other 2 abilities almost exclusively, but it isn't a very good Planeswalker anyway. Teferi Timebender. This is an Azorius Teferi Planeswalker. That's for 6. It has 5 loyalty, and its -9 is take an extra turn. This one's a bit better than Mu Yanling, although you are limited to only blue and white, not if you're playing mono blue, because its plus and minus are better than Mu Yanling's, and it's easier to get the extra turn off, but these are also prone to just being beaten down by your opponent's creatures. And then the best one of these is Teferi Master of Time. And I love this card. I think it's an absolutely fantastic card. It's 2 blue for 3 loyalty Planeswalker Teferi. You can activate loyalty abilities of Teferi Master of Time on any player's turn, anytime you could cast an instant. So you can use its plus each turn, and in 2 turn cycles you can -10 to take 2 extra turns after this one. And 2 extra turns is almost always game ending, especially in Atraxa decks where you are able to proliferate and tick up these counters with something like Ikamoon Gauntlet or Atraxa's ability. It makes it quite easy to actually reach this -10 to take 2 extra turns. It won't happen often, but looting every turn is still a great effect. I want to move on to some red extra turn spells, and red, yes, it does have quite a few extra turn spells as well. Almost all of them say at the end of that extra turn, you lose the game. So they are extremely high risk, high reward extra turn spells. And these are Warrior's Oath, Last Chance, Final Fortune, and Alchemist's Gambit. Warrior's Oath, Last Chance, and Final Fortune are all 2 red. Take an extra turn after this one, and at the end of that turn, you lose the game. Final Fortune being an instant makes it the best of these 3. And then Alchemist Gambit is 1 red to get that same effect, but you can play it for its cleave cost, which is 4 blue, blue, red, and then that is just an extra turn, and you don't lose the game at the end of that extra turn. Although they seem pretty decent, I think there's only one deck in the whole of Commander where these can actually see play efficiently, and that is in Obeka Brute Chronologist. This is a Grixis Ogre Wizard, and it says tap. The player whose turn it is may end the turn. You can then, when the trigger for you to lose the game from any of these go on the stack, you tap your Obeka to end the turn, and it exiles that lose the game trigger, and you don't lose the game instead. So these are absolutely fantastic includes in an Obeka deck. They should be in every Obeka deck, I think. Obeka struggles a bit already, so having these is a really nice bonus for you to really abuse your commander's ability. And then there's another one that can't fit in Obeka, and that is Chance for Glory. 1 red white instant. Creatures you control gain indestructible. Take an extra turn after this one. At the beginning of that turn's end step, you lose the game. So this is in Boros colors. It can't go in Obeka. It does give your whole board indestructible permanently, but this I see as being very difficult to actually include in a deck. In a Boros Angels deck, like Aurelia maybe, this can possibly see play if you're going to swing out for lethal damage in that extra turn. But other than that, I don't see it fitting that well in many decks. It can save your board, but at what cost? There are 2 giant extra turn spells which I consider to be game enders. These almost certainly end the game as soon as they resolve, and this is Time Stretch and Expropriate. Time Stretch is 8 blue blue sorcery for target player to gain 2 extra turns after this one. I've lost to this card in my friend's Joda Archmage Eternal deck, where he can cast it for Wooburg instead of paying 10, so it comes out a lot earlier, and having 2 extra turns with the Joda in play is unbelievably strong. But it fits what Joda is doing, playing giant spells with huge impact for Wooburg instead, and you still have to develop your board and get Joda out before you can actually make use of it. And then Expropriate, one of the most popular blue win cons in the format. And again, I would never include an Expropriate in my deck. It's just not really fun because whenever it resolves, you basically win. The only deck I would consider Expropriate for is a Tivit Seller of Secrets deck. Again, because of the voting thing, it's on theme. It just feels really good to include it in that deck because you get to vote in extra time. In that deck, though, it is even better as a win con because you get 2 extra turns guaranteed and you steal 1 thing from each of your opponents, making it even better as a win con in that deck. Generally, I avoid both of these cards because just playing solitaire by yourself with extra turns is not really fun for anyone else at the table. And then we have, after these game enders, there's a couple of permanent form extra turns. And what do I mean by that? These are, aside from creatures and planeswalkers, because those are permanents as well, there's a few artifacts and enchantments that act as extra turn spells as well. We have Gonti's Ether Heart, a 6-mana legendary artifact, and when Gonti's Ether Heart or another artifact enters under your control, you get 2 energy, and you can pay 8 energy and exile Gonti's Ether Heart to take an extra turn after this one. It works extremely well in artifact-themed commander decks. There's Magister's Scepter, also in artifact-themed decks or Proliferate-themed decks because it's a 3-mana artifact. You can pay 4 and tap it to put a charge counter on it, and you can tap and remove 3 charge counters from Magister's Straight Scepter to take an extra turn after this one. So that works well in Proliferate or Untap decks or in artifact decks where you want to build into those synergies anyway. And then we have an enchantment on the list, which is Second Chance. That's 2 and a blue enchantment. During your upkeep, if you have 5 life or less, you sacrifice it and take an extra turn after this one. This seems pretty bad to me because you play it out and then your opponents will just never set you to low enough life for it to trigger. They'll either kill you or have you have higher life. This works really well in a deck where you can manipulate your life total, paying life, so maybe in a Dimir pay life strategy. It is an enchantment, so you can recur it and use it over and over, which makes it a lot stronger in that specific situation. But in general, it'll be very difficult to utilize this card properly. So generally, I avoid cards like that. Too many hoops to jump through. And then we've got a few more permanents. These are all artifacts. There's Time Sieve, which goes infinite with Thopter Assembly. So Time Sieve is a blue-black artifact. You tap it and sacrifice 5 artifacts to take an extra turn to take an extra turn after this one. And Thopter Assembly is a 6 cost 5/5 artifact creature Thopter with flying. And at the beginning of your upkeep, if you control no Thopters other than Thopter Assembly, then you return it to your hand and you make 5 Thopters. So how this combo works is you play Thopter Assembly. On your upkeep, you get 5 Thopters and you bounce it. You then tap your Time Sieve and sacrifice all 5 Thopters for an extra turn, and you recast your Thopter Assembly. You go to your extra turn, you get 5 Thopters bouncing Thopter Assembly, and you rinse and repeat for infinite turns. I've lost to this in an artifact combo deck before. It is a good way to close out the game, and if you don't have the Thopter Assembly, Time Sieve can still turn a bunch of tokens that are lying around into an extra turn. Maybe you need to get back into the game. We then have a Time Sifter, which is a really old, interesting card. It's not very good, but it is quite interesting to talk about. It's a 5-cost artifact, and at the beginning of each player's upkeep, exile the top card of each player's library. The player who exiled the card with the highest converted mana cost takes an extra turn after this one, and if 2 or more players are tied, they repeat the process until the tie is broken. So if you're playing a deck where you always know what is on the top of your deck and you can manipulate the top of your deck with a Sensei's Divining Top or Brainstorm effects, so you are always guaranteed to have that extra turn, then this is an absolutely ridiculous card. You could put this in and constantly manipulate so you always win the exile at the upkeep and you can chain extra turns together. So in very, very specific decks, I can see how this might fit, but in general, it's extremely risky. You might end up just giving your opponents tons of extra turns, and then you don't do anything for the rest of the game. And that brings us to Ugin's Nexus, a 5-cost artifact as well. It's legendary, and if a player would begin an extra turn, that player skips that turn instead. So this is a card that counters extra turn spells, and I'll talk about a few more a bit later. How to counter extra turn spells, but it is itself an extra turn spell as well, because if it would be put into a graveyard, so when it's destroyed, you can exile it instead and you take an extra turn after this one. So if you're sacrificing artifacts, it might be a good include in a deck like that. So the extra turn spells that we've looked at already fit in specific themes, whether it is tribal or synergistic based on the deck you're playing, whether it's planeswalkers or in permanent form artifacts and enchantments. But what a lot of these have in common are, if they are not permanent, so if they are instants or sorceries, most of them exile themselves as it resolves. So this prevents you from abusing it and recurring it to use it over and over. Now this brings us to my next category of extra turn spells, and these are the ones that I think are not casual. Some of them see some competitive play, some of them don't, but in general I would recommend avoiding them, because if you do end up recurring them over and over, it is an extremely unfun situation for your opponents, possibly your friends, and they might just not enjoy playing Magic with you, which none of us want. What am I talking about? Well, these are Time Warp, Capture of Jingzhou, Temporal Manipulation. These are identical cards with different names. 3 blue sorcery, take an extra turn after this one, and these go to the graveyard, they do not exile, which allow you to abuse it by recurring it and using it again and again. And then the next 3 are Walk the Eons, which is a 6 mana sorcery that lets you take an extra turn. It doesn't exile, and it has buyback to sacrifice 3 islands. This sees some play in competitive Tatyova decks, which has kind of fallen out of competitive a lot recently with the speed at which some of the competitive decks can function at, but it can still combo to give you infinite turns in the right deck. And then the last 2, Beacon of Tomorrows and Nexus of Fate. These do see play in some competitive decks and allow you to just win the game when you get a combo with them off. Beacon of Tomorrows is an 8 mana sorcery that says target player takes an extra turn after this one and you shuffle it into your library. There are plenty ways of exiling your whole library, so when you cast it, you put it back in, and then that's the card you draw guaranteed. It's the only card left in your deck, so you can cast it turn after turn, and you take infinite turns. And then Nexus of Fate is a 7 mana instant that says take an extra turn, and if it would go to the graveyard, you reveal it and shuffle it into its owner's library instead. This, similarly to Beacon of Tomorrows, it combos with Isochron Scepter, so you can cast it over and over. And also, if it's the last card in your deck, then you can take infinite turns by casting it turn after turn. So these are a lot easier to abuse than most of the ones that exile themselves. I don't think they should see play in casual. They just generally aren't very fun, and the potential for abuse is high. So these ones I definitely avoid. I don't recommend playing these at all in your casual commander decks. We do have a couple of bad extra turns, which I'd like to talk about. And when I say bad, I mean generally unplayable because they are incredibly difficult to actually make use of. The first is Magosi, the Water Veil, which is a land. You have to skip turns to put Eon counters on it, and then you can spend Eon counters to take extra turns. Intentionally skipping a turn is so bad that it's never worth it to include this card, except we had a card in Warhammer 40k that was released as the second card ever to have Eon counters on it. When you place Eon counters on Out of the Tombs, which is the Warhammer 40k card, it gives you 2 Eon counters on your upkeep. You can use a Nesting Grounds, the land that moves counters, to move an Eon counter from Out of the Tombs onto Magosi, and then you spend that Eon counter to take an extra turn. It is a lot of hoops to jump through. If you pull it off, that is absolutely hilarious. But generally, Magosi is incredibly bad, and I would recommend not playing it unless you specifically want to include the scenario in your Dimir plus deck. The next ones we have is Search the City, which is a 5 mana enchantment. When it enters, you exile the top 5 cards of your library, and whenever you play a card with the same name as one of the exiled cards, you put one of those cards with that name into its owner's hand. Then if there are no cards exiled or Search the City, you sacrifice it, and if you do, you take an extra turn after this one. This is incredibly bad in Commander because you don't play any duplicates. You could jump through a wild number of hoops to get this to work. If you, for example, are in a mono blue deck and you're able to somehow stack 5 islands on the top of your deck, so those are what you exile, and then whenever you play an island, you remove one, so you have to have 5 islands on the top which you exile with the Search the City, and then you have to play 5 islands, and then you get an extra turn. So there are so many hoops to jump through with this card because it is not designed for Commander that it is just terribly bad and should never see play, I think. And then we have another one which is quite interesting. It's Wormfang Manta. It's a 5 blue creature, Nightmare Beast. It's a 6/1 flying, and when it enters, you skip your next turn, which is absolutely awful. And when it leaves play, you take an extra turn. The only situation I see this working in is if you have an effect that stops all Enter the Battlefield effects. When that is in play, then when you cast your Wormfang Manta, the Enter the Battlefield effect doesn't trigger, so you don't skip your next turn. And then if you sacrifice it or it leaves play, then you take an extra turn. But again, this is so many hoops to jump through, it is almost never worth it, unless you want to try and pull off some of these jank combos in your casual decks. I've got another one here, which I say is bad, but in the right situation, it can be pretty good, and that is Savor the Moment. It's a 1 blue sorcery. Take an extra turn after this one. You skip the untap step of that turn. This can be incredibly strong late game. It is a 3 mana extra turn spell, which is extremely low cost, but you do skip the untap. So if you're playing this early, let's say turn 3, you tap for 3 and play Savor the Moment, and then you go to your extra turn and you play a land, and then you pass. So it's essentially 3 mana ramp 1 early on, which is pretty bad. But late in the game, when you have a big board, or you can develop a big board by spending almost all your mana and then Savor the Moment, when you go to your extra turn, you don't need to cast. You can just swing out with your big board that you've developed the turn prior. So it can be strong late. The 3 cost late is also helpful when you want to build up a board and then cast it on the same turn to then use your big board you've developed. But early on, it is incredibly bad. I think the ceiling and the floor are incredibly far apart for this card. Moving on to non-blue or red extra turn spells. So all the extra turn spells so far have been either blue or red or Azorius or Izzet or in artifact form. But there are actually 2 extra turn spells that aren't in these colors at all. There's one in black and one in green. The black extra turn spell is Temporal Extortion. It's black, 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 black. So 4 black mana for a sorcery. When you play Temporal Extortion, any player may pay half their life, rounded up. If a player does, counter Temporal Extortion, and it says take an extra turn after this one. This is an absolutely brilliant card. I love it. 4 black pips mean you can only play this in a mono black deck or a 2-color deck that's very heavy on black unless you have fantastic fixing of colors in your deck. And for 4 mana, taking an extra turn is incredibly strong. The additional upside is instead of you taking an extra turn, an opponent has paid half their life, and that is almost worth it for 4 mana anyway. So it works both ways as a giant drain spell or as an extra turn spell. Really, really cool, interesting card. And then the green extra turn spell is called Seed Time. And this is 1 and a green instant, even though it says you can only play it during your turn. So it's kind of weird that it's an instant, but you can only play it during your turn. And it says take an extra turn after this one if an opponent played a blue spell this turn. So if you're trying to do really powerful things on your turn and your opponents are interacting with counter magic or pongifies or instant speed blue shenanigans that usually goes on, you can then respond by casting a Seed Time because they've tried to do something to you with a blue spell, and then you get an extra turn afterwards. So it's kind of a gotcha card where you've now caught them by surprise because they weren't expecting an extra turn because they were interacting on your turn. So quite an interesting card. It's very niche. If your play group has a lot of blue, then I think it can probably see play. It's pretty niche. Still really cool card though. That brings me on to what extra turn spells am I playing? Now, I've covered all the extra turn spells that are legal in Commander except for 2, and these are the 2 that I'm playing in one of my decks. And these are Temporal Mastery and Temporal Trespass. Temporal Mastery is a 5 blue blue sorcery. Take an extra turn after this one, and then it exiles. Expensive, and it exiles itself. It's not great casting it for its 7 cost, but it does have Miracle, 1 and a blue. You may cast the spell for its Miracle cost when you draw it, if it's the first card you drew this turn. So it can be a 2 mana extra turn spell, but the chances of this happening are extremely unlikely. And then the other one, Temporal Trespass, is 8 blue, 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 so an 11 mana sorcery to take an extra turn after this one, and then it exiles. But it does have Delve, so you can exile cards from your graveyard to reduce its cost for each card exiled this way. So this can be 3 blue pips for an extra turn spell. Now, why do I play these 2 specifically? I have an Emoti Celebrant of Bounty deck. And I absolutely love this deck. It is very high-powered casual. The deck is extremely explosive, and Cascade generally is extremely explosive. Emoti is a 3 green-blue 3/1 Naga Druid with Cascade, and it gives spells that you cast that cost 6 or greater Cascade. So if I get the Miracle of Temporal Mastery for 2 mana, I get a Cascade from 7 and take an extra turn. And Temporal Trespass, if I delve a lot of my graveyard, I can, for 3 mana, take an extra turn and Cascade from 11, which is unbelievably strong. So these 2 have extremely strong synergy with Emoti's Cascade effect. That's why I include them in that deck. There have been games where I have drawn them and intentionally not cast them because it would skyrocket me so far in the lead that it would actually be unfun for my opponents to play against. So I do hold back on playing these depending on the pod. If I'm playing against other extremely high-powered casual decks, then I will cast these to develop my board further. Sometimes I do hold them back because I know that extra turn spells aren't fun to play against. That sort of sums up extra turns for me in a nutshell. There are some that I think shouldn't see casual play at all. They are too strong and can be abused. There are some that are specifically synergistic with different themes. For example, the Temporal Mastery and Temporal Trespass in my Emoti Cascade deck, or Elrond's Epiphany and Foretell, or any of the creatures that have different tribal synergies, or Planeswalkers if you're doing a Planeswalker deck. These can fit in specific themes. I do recommend avoiding extra turn spells in general because they can be not fun to play against at all. But if you do have someone in your play group who does like playing those extra turn spells, maybe a Narset deck, there are a few options for countering extra turns. We have a newish card from Dominaria, United Commander, which is Gerard's Hourglass Pendant. It's a 1-cost legendary artifact with flash. If a player would begin an extra turn, that player skips that turn instead. So for just 1 mana, you can flash it in and prevent their extra turn. And for 4 and tap, exile it. You return to the battlefield tapped all artifact, creature, enchantment, and land cards in your graveyard. They were put there from the battlefield this turn. This is a great card. If you are fighting against a lot of extra turns all the time, it can be great at countering those extra turns. If you are playing against someone who is playing a lot of Wraths and wiping your board constantly, it can be great because you can activate the effect to return everything that got Wrathed back to your hand, so you can replay them. The next option is Stranglehold, also a great card. It's 3 and a red enchantment. Your opponent can't search libraries, so this shuts off tutoring. It shuts off a lot of green ramp that fetches lands. It shuts off fetch lands. That is just a really great ability on enchantment anyway. It also has, if an opponent would begin an extra turn, that player skips that turn instead. It has the added bonus of countering extra turn spells completely. And then Ugin's Nexus is a really weird one because although it makes extra turns be skipped, it also is an extra turn spell itself if it dies. So I'm really on the fence about Ugin's Nexus. I don't think I like it because although it counters extra turns, it does give you an extra turn, which I don't really like. It's like going both ways on the spectrum of whether you like extra turns or not. So I don't really know about Ugin's Nexus. I'm not the biggest fan. But what else can you do to counter extra turn spells? For the majority of the instant and sorcery ones, counter spells are the only option. There are a few that say target player takes an extra turn. You might be able to deflecting swat or misdirect it so you take an extra turn instead. But generally, counter spells will be your way of dealing with these extra turn spells. Counter spells aren't really fun either, but if you're fighting against a lot of extra turns, counter spells are necessary to fight back into that. If they want to make you not have fun, then make them not have fun, I guess. And then for all the permanent ones, planeswalkers, creatures, artifacts, enchantments, these are easily dealt with removal. A lot of those, I think, can see casual play because they are so easily removed. That's why I don't like Ugin's Nexus, because when it is destroyed, they get the extra turn. So you don't want to remove it. You actually have to exile it, which is quite tricky to exile an artifact. But there is plenty of fantastic removal in the format. So dealing with any of these permanent form ones is generally quite easy to do. So what do you think? Do you think extra turn spells are casual in Commander? Have I persuaded you that they are not for casual? They are for casual. Are some of them for casual? Do you like seeing extra turn spells in your Commander games? Do you play extra turn spells, and which ones? Let me know down in the comments below. And thanks for joining me today as we looked through these extra turn spells that are legal in Commander. And I hope to see you in the next one.